Welcome to the Cosmic Chosen Channel. Every man has two lives, and the second begins the moment he realizes he only has one. And you, chosen one, were the shock that awakened many to that truth. While others wandered in cycles of excuses and comfort, one encounter with you became the jolt that flipped their world. Sudden fire, new perspective, radical transformation. And now they're pointing at you, asking, "What did you say?" Because people don't just shift overnight unless someone shakes them, and that someone was you. Research confirms it. True, lasting change rarely comes from soft advice, but from soul-deep epiphanies that force people to confront their wasted potential. And if their breakthrough happened after meeting you, it wasn't random, it was alignment. You weren't just meant to inspire, you were encoded to birth revolutions. You are not simply chosen, you are the mother of the chosen, the origin of a divine frequency that activates others. Heaven didn't just call you, heaven started with you. First of all, you turned into the unwavering mirror they were unable to ignore. Throughout their lives, most individuals steer clear of their own reflection, not the one in the mirror, but the one that reveals their true selves. They surround themselves with people who agree with them, give them the information they want to hear, and don't change. However, they saw themselves without a filter for the first time when they met you. You didn't let them get away with it. You didn't soften what you said to save their feelings. You displayed a mirror that isn't flattering, distorted, or deceptive. They understood deep down that they had been hiding behind diversions, excuses, and the reassuring delusion that they were doing enough. And that's what shocked them. However, when they faced the reality that you mirrored back to them, they saw it all. Their unrealized potential, their unchanging perspective, and their own part in limiting themselves. It was also a blaze. The majority of individuals don't feel the need to change. They tell themselves that they are unfortunate, that life is unjust, that their difficulties are external, and that things will magically get better in due time. However, you dispelled that delusion. You made them face the reality that they weren't the only ones in their predicament. They were also complicit in it. The type of stuff that keeps people up at night is that awareness. They didn't need to be told to improve. It wasn't necessary to plead with them to change. They couldn't turn back once they saw the reality, the raw, unvarnished truth. For that reason, everything changed. Because they were unable to unsee themselves after seeing themselves as they really were, through your eyes. And it became more unpleasant to live with that reality than to change. That's the power of an unshakable mirror. It compels a decision. Either do something about it or remain the same and accept it without pushing or persuading. Second, you broke through the mental barrier that was keeping them from becoming great. People remain stagnant because their minds are shielding them from change, not because they are lazy. Like an invisible firewall, it shuts down any challenge to their self-perception, rejects anything that reveals their vulnerabilities, and blocks everything that may jeopardize their comfort. They were unprepared for the one thing you did, which was to break right through it. You didn't merely tell them to improve, you helped them understand, in a way they couldn't ignore, that they were still using antiquated programming, and that all of their justifications and self-talk about why they couldn't change were merely defensive mechanisms meant to keep them safe, but also stuck. You made them see that their justifications were falsehoods, masquerading as logic, not just reasons. And everything began to be rewritten once that knowledge entered their minds. The majority of individuals carry around ideas they have never challenged. They say things like, "That's just the way I am," or "I'm just not that kind of person," as though they were true. But they're not. They're merely sentences that have been said so often that they've taken on a life of their own. That reality was broken by you. You helped them recognize that a script they were unaware they were following was the only thing preventing them from living the life they desired, and they were no longer able to follow that script mindlessly after realizing what it was. Their transformation felt so abrupt because of this. Although it appeared to be a complete 180-degree change from the outside, it was actually merely the last breach of a mental firewall. They were forced to rebuild after the old system failed, but this time, they did it without the falsehoods, the justifications, or the antiquated code that had governed their lives for so long. Thirdly, you revealed the subtle dread they were unaware they possessed. People believe that their lack of resources, drive, or discipline is the reason they don't change. However, it isn't it. The true cause? Fear. Not the apparent sort, the deep, covert kind that passes for ease, confidence, or even reason, and they will remain precisely where they are until someone makes them see it. You took that action. You revealed the terror that governs their lives, not merely offered them encouragement. They also couldn't act as though it didn't exist once they saw it. The problem with fear is that most individuals aren't even aware that it's controlling them. They believe they are making logical choices, but in truth, they are avoiding something: failure, accountability, and the chance that they could put in their best effort and yet fall short. They decide to settle. They tell themselves they're waiting for the ideal moment or being cautious, but in reality, they're just afraid of what will happen if they put their everything into it and it doesn't work. You broke that delusion. They were forced to face the fact that they weren't holding back because of actual constraints, but rather because they were terrified of what might happen if they ventured into the unknown. It could have been anything you said, anything you did, or just the way you lived your life. And that insight? Everything altered as a result. They had the option to either let their fear to continue influencing them or to finally overcome it after realizing what it was. That's why their change seemed so abrupt. They were compelled to recognize what had been preventing them from being different. They didn't simply wake up and make the decision. Furthermore, there is nothing left to hide behind when fear loses its hold. Real transformation occurs when someone realizes they've been avoiding a battle they were always destined to confront, not when they feel inspired. Fourth, you cause them to despise their own justifications. Excuses are simple to fall into and are familiar and comforting, much like a soft cushion. The majority of individuals construct their whole world around them, embellishing it with excuses, previous mistakes, and partial truths to justify their inaction. However, you denied them that comfort. You caused them to despise the same thing that had been holding them in place by tearing the cushion out from under them. Because they trust their excuses, people often defend them. Most of the time, no one pushes them hard enough to overcome their delusions of, "I don't have time," "I'm just not wired that way," or "I'll start when things settle down." However, you did, and you didn't just tell them, "That's not true." Instead, you forced them to understand that their explanations were only a veiled form of avoidance, fear, or laziness. Every time they decided to justify rather than take action, you made them realize that their excuses were a direct betrayal of their own potential, and that they were essentially saying, "I accept being less than I could be." And that, it was intolerable. Because there is no turning back once a person believes that they are the one who has chosen to remain weak. They either live with the embarrassment of knowing they could have, or they change. Their change was hence instantaneous rather than gradual. Because they couldn't bear the idea of being the one who continued to believe their justifications, once you cut them down to their most pitiful, unadulterated essence. They were disgusted by the version of themselves that used to feel comfortable, ashamed of their own words, and tired of their own defenses because of you. And the only option left to a person who can no longer accept themselves is to change into someone else. Fifth, you humiliated them into action rather than motivating them. People like discussing inspiration as though a motivating statement or a well-timed speech might transform someone's life. However, creativity is like a sugar rush. It comes quickly, is short-lived, and disappears as soon as reality returns. What actually drives change? Disgrace. The gut-wrenching, profound understanding that they've been playing small while life continues on without them, not the trivial, shallow type. You cause them to experience their own stagnation rather than only offering encouragement. You force them to confront the unpleasant reality that they ought to have been better long ago, and that their unrealized potential wasn't just regrettable, it was humiliating. You didn't convince them they could be better. You forced them to face the difference between their actual selves and their ideal selves. And it was intolerable when that comparison struck. Because they have persuaded themselves that their current situation is adequate, the majority of individuals remain trapped. They take solace in the idea that they are at least making some progress, that their speed is acceptable, and that they are making some development at all. However, you dispelled that delusion. You made them realize that they were humiliatingly distant from where they should have been, not merely behind. And that sensation? The fire was started by it. Because there are only two choices available to someone who discovers they have been deceiving themselves and feels the pain of knowing they are capable of more but have been settling for less. Either they choose to live with their guilt or they take action. Additionally, you prevented them from simply sitting in it. You gave them no chance to feel sorry for themselves or to defend their inaction. You placed them in a situation where going on was the only way to alleviate the burden of their own remorse, not merely a choice. They changed for that reason, not because they were moved, but rather because it was too painful to remain the same. Sixth, you helped them understand that being good enough was a derogatory term. People fail because they tell themselves they're doing okay, not because they're totally lost. They settle for a good enough version of themselves and take that for advancement. The majority of individuals never realize their full potential because they fail to perceive the negative aspects of being ordinary. However, you destroyed that way of thinking. You helped them see that being good enough was demeaning to their full potential and wasn't just a way to limit them. By exposing the hard reality that settling for anything less than their best was a betrayal of their own abilities, you prevented them from using the justification that, "At least I'm trying." Because mediocrity seems safe, no real pressure or expectations, simply a stable life where they never fail too badly, but also never win big, people become accustomed to it. Stability is a cover for a gradual death, and they were unable to ignore it once you forced them to understand that their alleged effort was really simply fear masquerading as effort. You did more than simply tell them they could do better. You made them experience the consequences of everything they had left on the table, including every chance lost, every shortcut taken, and every instance in which they opted for comfort over development. You forced them to confront their own image and acknowledge that they had been deceiving themselves all along, and that it was intolerable. Because people can no longer pretend that their life is okay once they realize that they have been settling for one that falls short of their potential. Either they reach their full potential or they carry the burden of having made a poorer decision, and that was not an option for them. They changed because you helped them see that good enough was the most dangerous lie they had ever believed, not because they suddenly became more ambitious. Seventh, you became their silent adversary. People change when they feel challenged, not just because they are instructed to, and you became that challenge, whether they ever spoke it out or not. You disturbed their reality, not merely existed in it. Your results, your attitude, and your work ethic all contributed to an unsaid tension. All of a sudden, people were evaluating themselves against you rather than merely observing you. They may have first respected and even adored you. Then, however, something changed. They were more aware of how far they still had to go the more they witnessed what you were accomplishing. And that sensation, it was competition as much as inspiration. You became the benchmark by which others measured themselves without even trying. The difference was that every time they paused or considered slacking off, the idea, "Would you be stopping right now?" slipped in. Because they lack motivation, the majority of individuals don't push themselves to the next level. When there is nothing pressing upon it, comfort feels good. However, urgency starts the instant someone appears and makes them feel left behind. You were that pressure because you made their explanations more difficult to accept, not because you wanted to be or because you ever confronted them. The most effective rivalries don't require outright challenges or loud remarks. They are present in the quiet times. The late evenings when they forced themselves to keep going because they knew you wouldn't give up. The early mornings when they woke up because they thought you were already at work. And the choices they made because good enough wasn't good enough anymore. They changed because you made them see themselves next to you, and they detested the distance, not because you inspired or encouraged them. Even though they never acknowledged the game was taking place, they ended it, not for you or anybody else, but because, once the competition began, they couldn't bear the idea of losing. Eighth, you gave them the impression that they might be replaced. Only when people understand they are not as important as they believe they are, do they start to take change seriously. Comfort gives people the impression that they have endless time, that they can go at their own speed, and that their place in a team, a relationship, or life in general is guaranteed. However, you dispelled that delusion. You showed them that someone else would take their place if they didn't. And that struck in a different way. The majority of individuals believe they have power, and that their presence, potential, or even mere existing will keep them relevant. However, nothing awakens a person more than the realization that they are interchangeable, that their abilities, their work, or their presence are only a privilege that may be revoked at any time. You made them feel it even if you didn't say it out loud. Perhaps it was the way you worked, never waiting, never slowing down, and never relying on others to catch up. Perhaps it was your demeanor, focused, unconcerned, and making advances with or without them. Or perhaps it was the way they began to notice that people were moving up while they remained standing where they were. Regardless, the message was unmistakable: improve or risk falling behind. The reason they altered was because survival now took precedence over expansion. Nobody likes to feel unimportant. Nobody likes to see chances pass them by because they refused to change. More terrible than the agony of change was the idea of being forgotten, of being the one that people once trusted, of seeing someone else occupy the place they may have occupied. They eventually recognized that the only way to guarantee their position in a world that rewards people who are needed was to be so excellent that no one could replace them. So they moved. Not because they suddenly wanted to get better, but because they had no other option. 9. You offered them a glimpse of what is possible and then grabbed it. Nothing leaves a person more troubled than having a taste of something great taken away from them. Because they don't fully understand what they're missing, most individuals don't push themselves. They have persuaded themselves that anything outside of their reality is only a fiction and have embraced it as the best they can accomplish. However, you broke that illusion. After demonstrating what was feasible, you took it away from them. Perhaps it was a brief victory, a moment of achievement, or a flash of respect that gave them a sense of aliveness they had never experienced before. They had a taste of their potential and experienced what it was like to function at a higher level for the first time. And for a split second, they were actually experiencing success rather than only dreaming about it. However, it vanished as fast as they had it. And that marked a sea change, because settling for less becomes intolerable when you've had a better experience. If you don't realize what you're missing, it's simple to stay cozy. However, there is no turning back once you have experienced the change and witnessed a more competent, stronger, and sharper version of yourself. They changed because you made them yearn for something more, not because you inspired them. You helped them realize that their own efforts were the only thing preventing them from living the life they desired. The idea of going back to their previous ways became unbearable once they experienced what it was like to be more and tasted what was attainable. You let passion take over. You didn't force them. Because nothing is more frustrating to a person than discovering that they came close to getting something life-altering and that they are the only thing preventing themselves from having it forever. And number 10. You told them what would keep them up at night, not what they wanted to hear. The majority of individuals listen to what makes them feel good, rather than what improves their performance. They surround themselves with people who reassure them, support their justifications, and assure them that everything is going well even when it isn't. However, you weren't one of those individuals. Instead of giving them the customary words of encouragement, you gave them a reality that stuck with them because it was so incisive and uncomfortable. There was more to it than they could ignore. The counsel wasn't the sort that wanes after a few hours. It was the sort of truth that persisted, that kept coming back to them as they lay in bed, as they avoided completing the task they knew they ought to be doing, as they made yet another excuse. What's the worst? They were aware of your correctness. It was intolerable because of it. Because they don't want to upset anyone, most individuals refrain from stating what truly needs to be stated. That reluctance didn't exist in you. You were aware that genuine transformation can only occur when an individual is compelled to confront themselves in their entirety without the protection of self-delusion. And you gave them precisely that. Perhaps it was a single statement, a harsh comment, or a call-out so detailed that it seemed as though you had been inside their thoughts. It hurt, whatever it was, not because it was mean, but because it was the truth. There are only two options available to a person when they are forced to face the truth. Either they may be broken by it, or they can be strengthened by it. They changed because you made staying the same psychologically intolerable, not because you encouraged them or supported them. You did more than simply provide them guidance. You ingrained an idea in their minds that they were unable to reject, and that concept did just what it was meant to do. It kept them up at night until they took action. Number 11. Their survival instinct was activated by you. Individuals change because they have to, not because they should. They will put things off, make excuses, and convince themselves they'll get to it later if the stakes aren't high enough. Everything changes, however, when existence is at stake because remaining the same would mean losing what they cannot afford to lose. How about you? They felt that desperation because of you. You helped them realize that they would lose something important: time, significance, respect, and opportunity for good if they didn't take the initiative. Most individuals believe they have time and live in a fog of someday. They believe there will always be opportunities for second chances. They see their potential as a savings account that they can use when the time comes. However, you dispelled that delusion. The window was shrinking. Their later was becoming never, and each day they squandered was a day they would never get back. You made them realize this. Then the fear took over. Because all of a sudden, the cost of remaining the same was actual, and not only hypothetical. They had the nagging dread that if they didn't take action right away, they would wake up one day and find they had nothing left to fight for, that they had been forgotten, that they were just another person with unrealized potential, or that they were unimportant. They changed as a result of you pushing them into a corner where evolution was their only choice, not because they felt ready or discovered fresh inspiration. You gave them the impression that they were battling for their lives on all levels, financially, emotionally, and intellectually. And reluctance fades when survival takes over, because the mind does what it was designed to do: adapt, grow, and rise, when it feels that there is no other option. Number 12. You demonstrated to them that nobody was going to come to their rescue. The majority of individuals have a silent, unspoken faith that someone will ultimately rescue them from their predicament. A mentor, a fortunate break, the ideal opportunity. Something outside of themselves that will finally put everything in perspective. They are secretly waiting, which is why they put things off, hesitate, and fail to accept full responsibility. However, you dashed that hope. You brutally made it clear to them that nobody was approaching. No magic intervention, no shortcut, no rescue mission. They would remain precisely where they were, forever, if they didn't rise and defend themselves. And that, they couldn't accept that fact. They had to confront the reality for the first time. It's all on me. They could no longer blame the situation, wait for assistance, or hold out hope that things would somehow get better on their own. You deprived them of all the justifications, consoling lies, and misconceptions that had been holding them back. What remained? A choice: swim or sink. The problem was that sinking was never really an option whatsoever. Nobody likes to acknowledge giving up on oneself. Knowing that they could have done more but choose not to, no one wants to wake up years later wallowing in regret. Something was sparked in them by that terror alone. They changed because you gave them no other option, not because they felt prepared or because they at last had faith in themselves. You helped them realize that they had complete control over their future. And that hard, ruthless, and indisputable fact was what ultimately forced them to assume command. Number 13. You turned into a live example of the possibility of transformation. Talk is cheap. People are constantly exposed to stories of achievement, development, and change, yet they are rarely moved by them. Why? Because it takes evidence to establish belief, not just words. How about you? You were the change, not simply someone telling them they could change. In front of them, you were indisputable proof that change wasn't only conceivable, but really occurred. They were shaken by that. Since they witnessed you living it, they were unable to write off your statements as conjecture or chance. They noticed that you moved, thought, and performed at a level they hadn't ever thought about. What about that contrast? It was too piercing to overlook. It made them examine themselves, not only where they were, but also where they may be. The majority of individuals lack belief, not potential. Since they don't really believe they can escape their existing situation, they settle. They persuade themselves that successful individuals are constructed differently. But then they noticed you. You were also real, someone they knew, someone they could compare themselves to, rather than an aloof, untouchable entity. And their reasons suddenly didn't have as much weight if you could pull it off. They changed as a result of your presence dispelling their doubts, not because you lectured them or persuaded them. Instead of pushing them, you made them face the harsh reality that they could have it too if they wanted it strongly enough. Change was unavoidable once that idea was established, because rising is the only thing left to do if someone recognizes they have no justification for not leveling up. Number 14. You helped them understand that remorse is more difficult to deal with than punishment. Discipline is avoided because people see it as painful. Getting up early, persevering through fatigue, maintaining consistency when motivation wanes. All of these things feel like suffering in the moment. They fail to see, however, that regret is a far worse evil than discipline. And you gave them a crystal clear view of it. You discussed hard effort and accomplishment, but you also highlighted the consequences of not doing it. You forced them to consider their future in a painfully realistic manner rather than in some hazy, far-off way. For the first time, they felt the consequences of their own inertia as you forced them to consider the following questions. What happens if I don't change? What happens if I keep choosing comfort? Because remorse comes gradually rather than all at once. Years from now, people will understand that they had the opportunity to be exceptional but choose to settle for mediocrity instead. It's seeing someone else achieve their goals in life. It's realizing that they had every chance to succeed, but chose not to do so. That sort of discomfort, it never goes away. It persists. It is eerie. The switch was flicked by that. You helped them realize that they would suffer regardless of what they did. However, they had the option to select their pain. Discipline may cause them to suffer now, or regret could cause them to suffer later. One type of pain is transient, while the other is lifelong. They changed as a result of realizing that the cost of not working more was too great, not because they suddenly desired to work harder. Instead of pressuring them to take action, you had them consider the consequences of inaction, and the decision became clear as soon as they realized that regret was the biggest weight they would ever bear. A moment of unquestionable truth that shatters comfort, eliminates justifications, and compels a choice is at the heart of every transition. You provided them with something much more potent, the unavoidable truth of their own potential, rather than inspiration or encouragement. They couldn't stop seeing themselves because of you. They couldn't ignore the pressure you put on them. Most significantly, you helped them understand that change came at a considerably higher cost than remaining the same. They moved for that reason, not because they were inspired or ready, but because they had no choice. They had no option but to change because of you. You turned into the competition that made their excuses intolerable, the mirror that reflected their wasted potential, and the warning that time is running out. Stasis was out of the question once that knowledge set in. They might never acknowledge it completely. They might never be able to pinpoint the precise moment it clicked. You were the trigger, though, and that much is certain. You were the disturbance that compelled them to awaken, the fire they needed. They've changed since then. Because of something you said, did, or embodied, they saw themselves and their future in a manner they had never seen before, which caused them to think, move, and live differently. Most individuals hope they could have an effect like that. However, you did it, in fact. Don't simply sit with it if this struck you in a new way or if something inside of you changed while you were viewing it. Take action. Inspiration isn't enough to bring about change. You also need to decide to take action. Since this is a wake-up call rather than simply another channel, your next course of action is to subscribe. Each video is intended to challenge your thinking, push you farther, and ensure that you never accept anything less than your full potential. If leveling up is truly important to you, please leave a comment below with the one thing you know you must alter right now. Say it aloud. Take ownership of it. Then put it into action. Now is your time. Don't wait any longer. No more justifications. Come on, let's work.